The chill of the desert night clung to their uniforms, a stark contrast to the humid jungles they had left behind. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The rough canvas of their tents, the parched throats of the men, the very air they breathed. They had braced for the worst, for the legendary cruelty whispered in hushed tones across the Pacific. They expected starvation, torture, the ultimate humiliation that war inflicted upon the defeated. Every nerve was taut, every breath a shallow intake of fear, waiting for the inevitable crack of a whip or the brutal shove that would mark their new reality. But what they encountered instead was a bewildering, almost perverse normalcy. The American guards, though armed and watchful, moved with a disquieting efficiency rather than overt malice. The barracks, while Spartan, offered shelter from the wind that howled across the plains, a sound like a distant, mournful ghost. This wasn't the hell they had envisioned. It was something far more unsettling, an absence of expected torment that felt like a carefully laid trap. Was this a trick of a cunning enemy, or some bizarre form of salvation? The first shock wasn't the food, though its unfamiliar taste and abundance were certainly a jolt. Rice, yes, but also potatoes. Tinned meats and vegetables they hadn't seen in years, all served on sturdy metal trays. Nor was it the language barrier, though the guttural English often sounded like a harsh, unintelligible drumbeat. The true shock lay in the quiet hum of routine, a rhythm of existence that seemed utterly out of place for prisoners of war. Each morning, the precise clang of mess hall doors, the scent of coffee mingling with stale bread, the distant rumble of trucks on a dirt road. These mundane details chipped away at their hardened expectations. Still, a deep suspicion lingered. The Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated in a code that valued death over capture, viewed every gesture of their captors through a lens of profound distrust. The clean latrines, the basic medical attention, the steady supply of water. Each small comfort felt like a calculated maneuver. Why would the enemy system, supposedly bent on their destruction, provide such unexpected provisions? What ulterior motive lay beneath this veneer of order? This question, a silent torment, echoed in the confined spaces of their minds. Over the initial days, the rigid discipline of the camp became apparent. But it wasn't the discipline of their own military. It was a different kind, less about absolute submission and more about maintaining a strange, almost bureaucratic order. The guards, with their calm, measured tones, seemed more like wardens than tormentors. The distant aroma of their cigarettes, a sweet, alien scent, occasionally drifted into the prisoners' quarters. A small, yet potent, reminder of the outside world. What no one expected was how profoundly these seemingly benign conditions would begin to erode their carefully constructed mental defenses. Guarda es detalle. The very absence of overt cruelty became a new form of psychological pressure. It denied them the righteous anger they had prepared for, replacing it with a gnawing confusion. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth to a fine powder, and the prisoners, stripped of their weapons and their purpose, found themselves in a state of suspended animation. They were alive, but adrift, caught between the brutal past and an incomprehensible present. What would come next in this strange, quiet theater of war? The days bled into weeks, each one a slow, deliberate unfolding of the unexpected. The threat remained ambiguous, but its nature was shifting, becoming less about physical pain and more about the erosion of conviction. The air was thick with unspoken questions. If stories, real, that turn your expectation upside down interest you, subscribe to WW2 Beyond Battles to not miss the next twists. Com o passar das semanas, a inicial rigidez dos prisioneiros começou a ceder, não em rendição, mas em uma perplexa adaptação. O ar noturno, antes cortante, agora trazia o eco distante de uma gaita tocada por um guarda, uma melodia melancólica que flutuava sobre as barracas, estranhamente humano. Logo, a rotina diária se preencheu com mais do que apenas a subsistência. Um pequeno edifício de madeira, antes um depósito empoeirado, foi transformado em uma sala de leitura. Livros, alguns em japonês, outros em inglês, sobre temas que variavam de agricultura à literatura clássica, começaram a aparecer nas prateleiras improvisadas. O cheiro de papel velho e tinta se misturava ao silêncio quase reverente que preenchia o espaço, um contraste gritante com o barulho da guerra. Ainda assim, a dúvida persistia. Por que os americanos proporcionariam esse acesso ao conhecimento? Seria uma tentativa de reeducação sutil, um envenenamento lento de seus ideais através de narrativas estrangeiras. Os olhos dos prisioneiros, acostumados a decifrar a menor das intenções inimigas, agora lutavam para entender essa ambiguidade. Pequenos grupos se formavam, debatendo em sussurros, suas vozes abafadas pelo vento que assobiava pelas festas. A ameaça não era mais óbvia. Ela se escondia na própria generosidade, uma sombra silenciosa sobre a promessa de uma biblioteca. Enquanto isso, outras migalhas de estranhamento surgiam. A permissão para receber cartas do Japão, um privilégio inimaginável em qualquer outro cenário de guerra, chegou com a poeira e o som característico do jipe de entrega. O papel fino, com o cheiro desbotado de uma casa distante, era manuseado com uma reverência quase religiosa. Lendo as palavras de suas famílias, as vozes de seus entes queridos ecoavam no silêncio do deserto, trazendo consigo não apenas consolo, mas também uma dolorosa lembrança de tudo o que haviam perdido. Era um bálsamo, sim, mas um bálsamo que queimava. O que ninguém esperava era a introdução de atividades recreativas. Uma área aberta, nivelada com o esforço conjunto de prisioneiros e alguns guardas, tornou-se um campo rudimentar. O som oco de uma bola de beisebol batendo em um bastão improvisado, os gritos abafados de homens competindo, o suor que brilhava sob o sol impiedoso. Tudo isso era real. Era um escape físico, uma liberação da tensão acumulada, mas também uma estranha intimidade, um momento de contato que transcendia a barreira entre captor e cativo. A poeira que subia, com cada corrida, parecia carregar as tensões, mas não as dissipava por completo. Mas a questão do porquê permanecia como um espinho. Seria a intenção americana de manter os prisioneiros fisicamente aptos para algum propósito futuro? Ou era uma tática para diminuir a resistência e promover a conformidade? A cada pequena concessão, a cada gesto de humanidade que desafiava suas expectativas, a confusão se aprofundava. Era como se estivessem presos em um jogo onde as regras mudavam constantemente. E a única certeza era a incerteza. Guarde este detalhe. A normalidade que lhes era oferecida era, em si, a mais profunda anormalidade. Um paradoxo que roía as fundações de sua compreensão do mundo. Com o tempo, a observação mútua se tornou mais complexa. Os prisioneiros notaram a maneira como os guardas compartilhavam suas rações, como conversavam sobre suas famílias, como riam de piadas internas. Não eram os monstros desumanos que a propaganda havia pintado. Em contraste, os guardas começaram a ver os prisioneiros não apenas como o inimigo, mas como indivíduos, homens com histórias, com saudades, com a mesma capacidade de rir ou chorar. O cheiro do tabaco dos guardas, antes um mero detalhe distante, agora parecia menos alienígena, misturando-se aos odores da vida no campo. Ainda assim, a ameaça de ser enganado pairava. A possibilidade de que tudo fosse um truque elaborado para quebrar seu espírito, para minar sua lealdade ao imperador, era uma crença profundamente arraigada. Cada sorriso hesitante de um guarda, cada palavra gentil era filtrada através de camadas de desconfiança e doutrinação. O sol escaldante do deserto, que antes parecia um inferno, agora parecia iluminar uma armadilha psicológica, mais insidiosa do que qualquer tortura física. O que viria depois, neste teatro de operações onde as balas haviam sido substituídas por estranhas gentilezas? The quiet battles waged within the camp walls were not fought with bullets, but with the insidious drip of normalcy. Soon, a designated area was set aside for personal grooming, a small concession that felt monumental. Here, under the stark desert sun, prisoners could cut each other's hair with rudimentary shears. The snip, 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 a rhythmic counterpoint to the ever-present wind. The faint, clean scent of American soap, a luxury previously unimaginable, began to permeate the air around the washstands, a strange aroma of domesticity in a place of war. This small ritual, a return to a basic human dignity, chipped away at the hardened resolve of men who had expected to be stripped of everything. But these small liberties only deepened the mystery. Why would their captors provide such an opportunity for self-care, for maintaining an appearance that, by their own code, no longer mattered? The threat of humiliation had been replaced by a bewildering respect, a gesture that felt less like compassion and more like a deliberate, unsettling strategy. The guards, observing from a distance, offered no explanation, their faces unreadable beneath the brims of their caps. The silence that often fell over the grooming area was heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions about the true intentions behind such baffling kindness. With the passage of time, a system for minor privileges began to emerge, not as a reward for collaboration, but for adherence to camp regulations. Small tokens, almost like currency, could be earned for diligent work on camp sanitation or for maintaining order within the barracks. These tokens could then be exchanged for items at a rudimentary camp store: a pack of American cigarettes, a bar of chocolate, a new toothbrush, the crinkle of paper wrappers, the sweet, foreign taste of sugar, the unexpected warmth of a small, earned comfort. These were micro-rebellions against their own ingrained expectations of suffering. Still, the question persisted: what was the true cost of these concessions? Was this a subtle attempt to foster dependence, to undermine their sense of self-sufficiency and loyalty? The very act of choosing between a cigarette and a piece of candy felt like a betrayal of the stoicism they were meant to embody. The sun beat down, turning the metal roof of the store into a shimmering haze, reflecting the internal turmoil of men grappling with an enemy who offered not chains, but choices. The desire for a small pleasure warred with the deeply ingrained suspicion that every American gesture was a trap. En cuanto hizo, the lines between captor and captive blurred in unexpected ways. On occasion, American guards would play baseball on the makeshift field, their laughter echoing across the dusty expanse, sometimes joined by the hesitant cheers of the Japanese prisoners. The thwack of the ball, the shouts of encouragement, the sheer physicality of the game — it was a shared moment of release, a temporary suspension of hostilities. The dust that rose from the field mingled with the scent of exertion, a universal language of sport that transcended the barbed wire. The unspoken rules of engagement were changing, but to what end? The guards, too, seemed to observe their prisoners with a growing, if cautious, curiosity. They saw not just the enemy, but men who also enjoyed a game, men who cared for their appearance, men who yearned for news from home. The distant chatter of their own conversations, often about families or mundane concerns, drifted over to the prisoner barracks, revealing a shared humanity that was profoundly unsettling. It was a glimpse behind the enemy mask, a realization that the other side was not a monolithic evil, but composed of individuals. The next shock arrived subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Whispers began to circulate about a new recreation activity, something beyond books or sports. A small, nondescript building, previously used for storage, was being cleared. The sound of hammers and the faint smell of fresh paint drifted across the camp, hinting at a transformation. Guards were seen hauling in strange, heavy boxes, their contents a mystery. The anticipation itself became a new kind of tension, a nervous hum that settled over the camp like the desert dust. What strange new offering would the Americans present this time, and what hidden agenda would it conceal? The threat had evolved from physical brutality to a more insidious, psychological erosion, challenging the very core of their beliefs, not with force, but with baffling, almost benevolent gestures. The transformation of the old storage building continued, a slow, methodical process that captivated the prisoners' attention. The rhythmic clang of hammers striking nails, the rasp of saws cutting through timber, and the low murmur of American voices drifted across the compound. Carried by the relentless desert wind, a new scent joined the camp's familiar medley of dust and stale cooking, the sharp, metallic tang of fresh paint, hinting at a purpose beyond mere utility. Guards, now accustomed to the prisoners' curious stares, moved with an almost casual confidence, hauling in more of the strange, heavy boxes. Their size and weight suggested machinery. But for what purpose in this desolate landscape? The ambiguity of these preparations only intensified the gnawing uncertainty. The mental battle was becoming more profound than any physical hardship. Each day brought another layer of baffling normalcy, another challenge to their deeply ingrained beliefs. The American guards, far from being the brutal, faceless enemy, sometimes exchanged brief, almost polite nods with prisoners. One afternoon, a guard even offered a hesitant konnichiwa, mispronounced but clearly well-intentioned, to a group working on camp sanitation. The simple, unexpected greeting hung in the air, a small, unsettling ripple in the rigid order of things. Was this a genuine attempt at communication, or merely another calculated move in a larger, unseen game? With the interior work progressing, glimpses through the open doorway of the transformed building revealed more tantalizing details. Rough wooden benches were being installed in neat rows, facing a newly constructed screen of stretched white canvas. The space, once dark and dusty, was now surprisingly clean, almost expectant. The faint hum of a generator, previously used for camp lighting, now seemed to emanate from near the building, a low thrumming pulse in the otherwise quiet afternoons. The air inside, though still warm, felt different, charged with an unspoken potential. What elaborate performance were they being prepared for? The prisoners, accustomed to a life where every action had a clear purpose, struggled to decipher this new enigma. Their discussions grew more intense, held in hushed tones beneath the watchful eyes of their captors. Some speculated it was a lecture hall, a place for propaganda to be disseminated. Others feared it was an interrogation chamber, disguised in a veneer of comfort. The threat, once a looming shadow of physical pain, had shapeshifted into a subtle psychological erosion, challenging their very understanding of war and captivity. Each day, the question of why echoed more loudly in their minds. Small micro-gestures began to emerge, betraying the internal shifts. A hesitant glance at a guard during a comedic scene, a shared, almost imperceptible smile, the quiet acceptance of a piece of candy offered during an intermission. These weren't acts of defiance, but moments of human connection that defied the established narrative of absolute enemy. The crisp, clean smell of freshly laundered uniforms, now a regular occurrence thanks to the camp facilities, mixed with the ever-present desert dust, creating a strange blend of order and desolation. What would they be asked to witness in this new, unsettling space? The final preparations for the mysterious building reached a fever pitch. On a particularly hot evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The guards made a final significant delivery. 2 large heavy crates, clearly marked with stenciled letters, were carefully carried inside. The prisoners, gathered outside their barracks, watched in rapt silence. One of the guards, wiping sweat from his brow, caught the eye of a prisoner and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of shared effort, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement of the momentous unveiling to come. Inside the building, the generator's hum grew steadier, a low, continuous drone. The air, thick with the scent of new wood and anticipation, seemed to vibrate. The guards, with an air of quiet efficiency, began to uncrate the mysterious contents. The prisoners, though still confined, could feel the energy shift, the camp holding its breath. This wasn't just another strange routine. This was something entirely new, something designed to penetrate deeper than their physical defenses. The threat of cultural erasure remained, but it was now intertwined with a creeping sense of curiosity, a desire to understand the logic behind the other side's actions. The stakes had escalated from personal honor to the very integrity of their belief system, now challenged not by brutality, but by baffling kindness. The time had come for the curtain to rise on the Americans' most audacious and perplexing experiment. What would the flickering light reveal? The evening air, usually filled with the mournful howl of the wind, now carried a different sound, a steady, rhythmic whirring emanating from the transformed building. A low murmur of curiosity rippled through the ranks of the Japanese prisoners as they were led, not to their barracks, but towards this new, mysterious structure. The scent of fresh paint was still detectable, but now mingled with a faint, unfamiliar warmth, almost electrical. Inside, the space was dim, illuminated only by a single bare bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. Rough wooden benches, now filled, creaked under their weight. Then, with a soft click, the single bulb extinguished, plunging the room into near total darkness. A collective intake of breath swept through the prisoners. This was it, the moment of revelation. Was it a trap? A psychological interrogation? The air grew heavy, with unspoken tension, the darkness amplifying every rustle of clothing, every shift on a bench. The threat, once ambiguous, now felt acutely present, though its form remained elusive. Suddenly, a powerful beam of light, brilliant and pure, sliced through the darkness from the back of the room. It hummed with a quiet intensity, cutting through the dusty air like a physical entity, hitting the white canvas screen at the front with a startling clarity. This was the projector, the symbol of their bewildering new reality. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, tinged with the faint, sweet smell of warm celluloid beginning to turn. The prisoners, eyes wide, leaned forward, a silent, unified mass fixed on the screen. What flickered to life on the canvas was not propaganda, nor a lecture, but images in motion. A black and white world filled with exaggerated gestures and boisterous laughter. The first film was a comedy, a slapstick spectacle of pratfalls and chases. The sound, initially tinny and distant, soon filled the room, a cacophony of cheerful, unfamiliar English voices. The guards, positioned along the walls, watched alongside them, their faces illuminated by the dancing light, their own expressions mirroring the unfolding scenes. This shared, absurd ritual of watching a film with their captors was utterly beyond comprehension. A hesitant chuckle, low and almost imperceptible, escaped from one of the prisoners, quickly stifled. Then another, slightly louder. The initial rigid defiance began to subtly shift. Not all, certainly, but enough to create a new dynamic. Small microgestures emerged. A hesitant glance at a guard during a comedic scene, a shared, almost imperceptible smile, the quiet acceptance of a piece of candy offered during an intermission. The threat of cultural erasure remained, but it was now intertwined with a creeping sense of curiosity, a desire to understand the logic behind the other side's actions. The stakes had escalated from personal honor to the very integrity of their belief system, now challenged not by brutality, but by baffling kindness. Respira. If stories real that turn your expectation upside down interest you, subscribe to WW2 Beyond Battles to not miss the next twists. The movies continued, a regular occurrence now, twice a week. The projector became a focal point, its whirring mechanism a constant, almost comforting backdrop to the flickering images. They saw newsreels, carefully curated to show the American war effort, but also dramas, westerns, and even animated cartoons. The emotional range was vast. They watched heroes triumph, lovers embrace, villains fall. The shared darkness of the room, punctuated only by the projector's beam, became a strange crucible where the lines between enemy and human began to blur. The guards, too, seemed to relax, their posture less rigid, sometimes even offering a quiet comment or a nod during a particularly moving scene. But the question persisted. Why? Why this expense, this effort, this shared experience? Was it a subtle form of re-education? A way to subtly indoctrinate them into American ideals? Or was it something else, something far more complex and unsettling? The smell of popcorn, occasionally offered by the guards during an intermission, mingled with the familiar desert dust, a bizarre sensory blend of normalcy and captivity. The men, once solely focused on survival and resistance, now found themselves grappling with a new kind of battle, a battle for their very perception of the enemy. The films, in their simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical, depths of human nature in wartime. They saw American soldiers portrayed as brave, yes, but also as vulnerable, as men who missed their families, who harbored fears. This direct, unfiltered glimpse into the other side's humanity was a profound shock, chipping away at years of indoctrination. The projector's light, in its simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical, depths of human nature in wartime. It was not a trick for physical harm. The threat was a psychological one, aimed at the very foundations of their belief system. The initial fear that these screenings were a prelude to torture, a cunning psychological ploy for coercion, began to recede. What replaced it was a deeper, more insidious disquiet. This wasn't about breaking their bodies, but about challenging their minds, their understanding of the world. The shared laughter during a comedic scene, the collective sigh at a dramatic twist, the quiet contemplation during a somber moment, these were not acts of surrender, but undeniable moments of human connection, forging an unexpected, unsettling bond. The warmth of the projector's lamp, once a source of suspicion, now felt like a beacon, illuminating a path into a landscape of moral ambiguity. The loop of the threat had closed. This was not about immediate danger, but about a long, slow erosion of certainty. The challenge now was not to resist physical pain, but to resist empathy, to resist the unsettling realization that their enemies were, in many ways, just like them. The flickering images on the screen, the shared darkness, the quiet presence of the guards, it all created an atmosphere where the rigid categories of us and them began to soften at the edges. What would this strange experiment leave behind? What legacy would these shared moments in the dark forge for men caught between two warring worlds? The shared darkness of the makeshift cinema became a peculiar sanctuary. Here, under the flickering light of the projector, the rigid roles of captor and captive seemed to dissolve, if only for an hour or two. The distinct aroma of stale popcorn, occasionally distributed by the guards, mixed with the ever-present desert dust and the faint metallic scent of the projector lamp, creating a unique sensory signature for these evenings. Men who had been sworn enemies now sat side by side, their faces illuminated by the same dancing images, their breaths held collectively during moments of suspense. This wasn't merely entertainment. It was a profound, unsettling lesson in shared humanity. They watched dramas where American families struggled with universal fears, where soldiers faced moral dilemmas, where children laughed and cried. The subtle shifts in posture, the occasional clearing of a throat, the almost imperceptible nods of understanding that passed between Japanese prisoners and their American guards during a poignant scene. These were tiny yet monumental cracks in the wall of animosity. The projector, with its rhythmic hum, was relentlessly chipping away at years of ingrained hatred. But how could this be? The propaganda had painted their enemies as barbaric, as devoid of honor or empathy. Yet here they were, witnessing the very human struggles of those same enemies on a screen, and seeing the guards themselves react with genuine emotion. The question of why deepened, becoming less about suspicion and more about a profound cognitive dissonance. The desert nights, once filled with the silent tension of captivity, now resonated with the echoes of shared narratives, each one a whisper of a world beyond their rigid understanding. With each film, the prisoners found themselves inadvertently absorbing more than just plots. They observed the customs, the social interactions, the subtle nuances of American life. A scene of a family dinner, the clinking of silverware, the casual conversation, the warmth of the lamplight. These details, once utterly alien, began to register as recognizable patterns of human existence. The very air in the cinema, thick with the scent of human bodies and the faint smell of celluloid, felt less hostile, more neutral. The impact was not immediate or universal. Some prisoners maintained their stoic defiance, eyes unreadable, minds closed to the messages flickering before them. But for many, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The shared laughter during a comedic chase, the collective gasp at a dramatic revelation, the quiet contemplation during a somber ending. These were not acts of collaboration, but involuntary human responses. They were moments that transcended language and ideology, moments where the shared experience of storytelling bypassed the intellectual defenses. Guarda este detalle. The projector became more than a machine. It was a lens, not just showing stories, but revealing the hidden mechanisms of American power, not through force, but through cultural immersion. It demonstrated a profound, unsettling strategy. The flickering light on the screen was a silent, relentless interrogator, asking them to reconcile their deeply held beliefs with the undeniable humanity unfolding before their eyes. The stakes had indeed escalated, from personal honor to the very integrity of their belief system. The soft clicking of the film reel was a constant reminder of this ongoing psychological battle. Silencio por un instante. If this made sense, in the first link there is the complimentary episode with behind-the-scenes, photos, and accounts that amplify this turning point. The projector, then, was the symbolic turning point. It wasn't a weapon, but it was profoundly effective in its own way. It offered a window, not into American military might, but into its cultural soul, its everyday life, its dreams and fears. This was the mechanism behind the paradox. The Americans were not trying to break them with cruelty, but to disarm them with understanding, to expose them to a different way of seeing the world. The constant whirring of the machine, the warmth of its lamp, the hypnotic dance of light and shadow, all of it conspired to create an environment of unsettling revelation. The belief that their enemies were monolithic, utterly foreign, and inherently evil began to fray at the edges. They saw themselves reflected, in fragmented ways, in the struggles and joys of the characters on screen. This wasn't about converting them to American ideology, but about demonstrating a shared human substrate that transcended the brutality of war. The smell of the desert, usually harsh and unforgiving, now carried the faint, almost sweet scent of shared experience, a strange blend of captivity and connection. The realization was a slow, agonizing burn. The kindness wasn't a trick for immediate physical harm. It was a strategy to challenge their worldview, to plant seeds of doubt about the absolute righteousness of their cause and the absolute depravity of their enemy. The projector's beam, cutting through the smoky air of the cinema, illuminated not just the screen, but the profound chasm between their indoctrination and the complex reality of human nature. This was the ultimate psychological warfare, waged not with bullets, but with empathy. The question of why had begun to find its answer, not in a single revelation, but in the cumulative weight of shared moments. What legacy would these shared moments in the dark forge for men caught between two warring worlds? The quiet battles waged within the camp walls were far from over, yet their nature had irrevocably changed. The projector, with its rhythmic whirring, continued its relentless work, weaving narratives that challenged the very fabric of the prisoner's understanding. Each film, a seemingly innocuous piece of American culture, became a subtle, potent instrument of psychological disruption. The men, once unified by a shared, unyielding ideology, found themselves increasingly isolated in their internal struggles, grappling with a dissonance that grew more profound with every flickering image. The initial shock of shared entertainment had given way to a more insidious form of bewilderment. They watched American families laugh, cry, and argue, their emotions raw and relatable, cutting through the layers of wartime dehumanization. The smell of warm celluloid, a faint, almost chemical aroma, became inextricably linked to these unsettling revelations. It was a scent that promised escape, yet delivered a deeper form of entanglement. How could these be the same people their propaganda had demonized, the enemy they were sworn to despise? The very air in the dim, makeshift cinema seemed to thicken with unspoken questions, with the weight of conflicting truths. With the passage of weeks, the routines solidified. The walk to the cinema, once fraught with apprehension, became a strange, almost anticipated ritual. Prisoners would glance at the guards, not with outright hostility, but with a flicker of shared expectation as they approached the building. The generator's low thrum, a familiar prelude. The rough wooden benches, once alien, now bore the faint imprints of countless hours spent in shared contemplation. This was not conversion, not yet, but a slow, almost imperceptible softening of the rigid lines of hatred, a quiet erosion of certainty. The challenge was not to surrender, but to understand. Why did these Americans, their captors, invest so much in showing them these intimate glimpses into their own lives? Was it a twisted form of psychological torture, designed to break their spirit by confusing their loyalty? Or was there a deeper, more unsettling intent? The warmth emanating from the projector's lamp, a steady glow cutting through the dusty air, seemed to symbolize this enigma, a source of light that illuminated, yet simultaneously obscured, the true purpose behind it all. The question of why pulsed beneath the surface of every shared silence, every hesitant glance. The films presented a world of contradictions to the Japanese prisoners. They saw the vastness of the American landscape, the bustling energy of its cities, the simple joys of its domestic life. These images, vibrant and compelling, stood in stark contrast to the narratives of a decadent, weak enemy they had been fed. The sound of American dialogue, once a harsh, guttural noise, now began to carry inflections of humor, sorrow, and tenderness. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible shift, but one that chipped away at the monolithic image of their foe. Yet the internal conflict was immense. To acknowledge the humanity of their captors was for some to betray their fallen comrades, their emperor, their very nation. It was a profound moral dilemma, waged in the quiet confines of their own minds, under the flickering gaze of Hollywood. The scent of stale popcorn, sometimes distributed during intermissions, mingled with the metallic tang of fear and confusion, creating a sensory memory that would forever be associated with this unsettling period of reevaluation. The very fabric of their identity, woven from years of fierce nationalistic pride, was being unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. The guards, too, were affected. Initially, their presence had been strictly supervisory, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. But as the weeks wore on, small, almost imperceptible changes occurred. A guard might offer a quiet, almost sympathetic sigh during a poignant scene, or a brief, shared smile during a moment of slapstick comedy. These were tiny cracks in the wall, not of animosity, but of the rigid roles prescribed by war. The air, thick with human presence, began to carry a different kind of charge, one of shared, albeit reluctant, experience. The true test, however, lay not in the darkness of the cinema, but in the harsh light of their memories. What would they carry home from this bizarre interlude? For many, the images would become indelible, woven into the fabric of their post-war lives. The projector, once a symbol of an ambiguous threat, had transformed into a reluctant teacher, offering lessons not of military strategy, but of shared human experience. The question of its ultimate legacy, however, remained open, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their days. The cultural immersion was not a one-way street. While the prisoners absorbed American life, the guards, too, gained a subtle, invaluable understanding of the Japanese psyche. Watching their reactions, their moments of guarded amusement or quiet contemplation offered insights far beyond any interrogation report. The shared darkness of the room, punctuated only by the projector's beam, became a silent laboratory for cultural exchange, where empathy, however grudging, began to take root. The paradox of their captivity deepened. They were prisoners, stripped of their freedom and dignity, yet offered a window into the very culture they were fighting against. The meals, though simple, were regular and sufficient, a stark contrast to the starvation many expected. The clean uniforms, laundered regularly, offered a measure of physical comfort. This wasn't the brutal, dehumanizing experience they had braced for. It was something far more complex. A bewildering tapestry of control and strange, baffling kindness, all underscored by the hypnotic whir of the projector. The lingering scent of desert dust, ever present, now seemed to mingle with the faint, sweet smell of possibility, or perhaps profound disorientation. The films had not converted them, but they had undeniably broadened their horizons, forcing them to confront a reality far more nuanced than their indoctrination allowed. The quiet dignity of their resistance was now tested not by physical pain, but by the insidious drip of shared humanity. The question of why was slowly, agonizingly yielding answers that were both factual and emotionally devastating. The memory of those flickering images of shared laughter and tears with their former enemies would become an indelible part of their trauma and their re-entry into a shattered world. It wasn't a story of wholesale conversion, but of profound, unsettling encounters that defied easy categorization. The war was fought with bombs and bullets, but in these remote camps, another battle raged, a quiet, psychological conflict waged with the universal language of cinema. The projector's light, in its simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical depths of human nature in wartime. What would they do with this unsettling knowledge when they eventually returned home? The unsettling knowledge they carried, born from the flickering light of the projector, did not vanish with the final credits. Instead, it burrowed deep, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of their lives. When the cinema went dark and the men returned to their barracks, the images lingered, replaying in the mind's eye. The shared laughter, the tears, the moments of universal human emotion, these were not easily dismissed as propaganda. They were experiences, felt collectively, that defied the rigid categories of enemy and ally, leaving behind a profound internal tremor. The desert wind, once a constant reminder of their desolate captivity, now seemed to whisper fragments of American dialogue, carrying the faint, sweet scent of celluloid and the ghost of popcorn. Over the ensuing months, the camp itself began to subtly transform, not in its physical structure, which remained sparse and functional, but in its atmosphere. The guards, no longer mere faceless overseers, were now individuals whose reactions had been witnessed in the dim light of the cinema. A shared glance, a fleeting nod of understanding during a particularly poignant scene, had forged an unexpected, almost imperceptible thread of connection. This wasn't friendship, nor was it a surrender of their defiance, but a grudging acknowledgement of shared humanity. The rhythmic clinking of mess kits at mealtimes, once a stark reminder of their subjugation, now sometimes accompanied quiet, low-voiced discussions about the latest film, a new, strange ritual taking root. The true impact, however, was yet to be fully understood, even by those who orchestrated this peculiar experiment. For the American intelligence officers, watching the prisoners' reactions, observing their subtle shifts in demeanor and conversation, offered invaluable, fragmented insights into the Japanese psyche. It was a live, ongoing study, revealing nuances of culture and emotion far beyond what any interrogation could provide. This wasn't merely about breaking their will, but about understanding the intricate mechanisms of their belief system, a crucial endeavor that would influence post-war strategies and intelligence doctrine. The warmth of the desert sun, beating down on the camp, felt less like a symbol of harsh punishment and more like an indifferent observer to this complex, unfolding psychological drama. But what would happen when these men, steeped in such a paradoxical experience, eventually returned to a shattered homeland? The transition was brutal for many. They carried not just the scars of war and imprisonment, but also the indelible memory of those flickering images, of shared laughter and tears with their former enemies. It was a cognitive dissonance that few could articulate, a secret burden. How could they reconcile the barbarism of war with the baffling kindness they had experienced, the demonized enemy with the flawed, relatable humans on screen? The texture of the rough uniforms they wore daily now felt like a second skin, clinging to memories that refused to fade, a constant tactile reminder of their time in the desert. This wasn't a story of wholesale conversion, nor was it a simple tale of forgiveness. It was a profound, unsettling encounter that defied easy categorization, leaving a complex legacy. For some, the films had planted seeds of doubt, questioning the absolute narrative they had been fed, forcing an agonizing reevaluation of their worldviews. For others, it deepened their resolve, interpreting the kindness as a more insidious form of psychological warfare, a subtle attempt at cultural erasure. The smell of the familiar desert dust, once a symbol of their confinement, would forever be associated with this period of intense internal struggle, a constant sensory callback to their bewildering education. The quiet battles waged within the camp walls, fought not with bullets, but with light and shadow, had indeed left their mark. The projector's light, in its simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical depths of human nature in wartime. It had forced a confrontation with empathy, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the brutal realities of conflict. The sound of the whirring projector, once a source of ambiguous threat, now echoed in the chambers of their memory as a symbol of an unsettling truth, a truth that would forever shape their re-entry into a world struggling to rebuild. The question of why had begun to find its answers in the long-term, subtle shifts in perception and the quiet, persistent memories that refused to be silenced. The unsettling knowledge they carried, born from the flickering light of the projector, did not vanish with the final credits. Instead, it burrowed deep, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of their lives. When the cinema went dark and the men returned to their barracks, the images lingered, replaying in the mind's eye. The shared laughter, the tears, the moments of universal human emotion. These were not easily dismissed as propaganda. They were experiences, felt collectively, that defied the rigid categories of enemy and ally, leaving behind a profound internal tremor. The desert wind, once a constant reminder of their desolate captivity, now seemed to whisper fragments of American dialogue, carrying the faint, sweet scent of celluloid and the ghost of popcorn. Over the ensuing months, the camp itself began to subtly transform, not in its physical structure, which remained sparse and functional, but in its atmosphere. The guards, no longer mere faceless overseers, were now individuals whose reactions had been witnessed in the dim light of the cinema. A shared glance, a fleeting nod of understanding during a particularly poignant scene, had forged an unexpected, almost imperceptible thread of connection. This wasn't friendship, nor was it a surrender of their defiance, but a grudging acknowledgement of shared humanity. The rhythmic clinking of mess kits at mealtimes, once a stark reminder of their subjugation, now sometimes accompanied quiet, low-voiced discussions about the latest film, a new, strange ritual taking root. The true impact, however, was yet to be fully understood, even by those who orchestrated this peculiar experiment. For the American intelligence officers, watching the prisoners' reactions, observing their subtle shifts in demeanor and conversation, offered invaluable, fragmented insights into the Japanese psyche. It was a live, ongoing study, revealing nuances of culture and emotion far beyond what any interrogation could provide. This wasn't merely about breaking their will, but about understanding the intricate mechanisms of their belief system, a crucial endeavor that would influence post-war strategies and intelligence doctrine. The warmth of the desert sun, beating down on the camp, felt less like a symbol of harsh punishment and more like an indifferent observer to this complex, unfolding psychological drama. But what would happen when these men, steeped in such a paradoxical experience, eventually returned to a shattered homeland? The transition was brutal for many. They carried not just the scars of war and imprisonment, but also the indelible memory of those flickering images of shared laughter and tears with their former enemies. It was a cognitive dissonance that few could articulate, a secret burden. How could they reconcile the barbarism of war with the baffling kindness they had experienced, the demonized enemy with the flawed, relatable humans on screen? The texture of the rough uniforms they wore daily now felt like a second skin, clinging to memories that refused to fade, a constant tactile reminder of their time in the desert. This wasn't a story of wholesale conversion, nor was it a simple tale of forgiveness. It was a profound, unsettling encounter that defied easy categorization, leaving a complex legacy. For some, the films had planted seeds of doubt, questioning the absolute narrative they had been fed, forcing an agonizing reevaluation of their worldviews. For others, it deepened their resolve, interpreting the kindness as a more insidious form of psychological warfare, a subtle attempt at cultural erasure. The smell of the familiar desert dust, once a symbol of their confinement, would forever be associated with this period of intense internal struggle, a constant sensory callback to their bewildering education. The quiet battles waged within the camp walls, fought not with bullets but with light and shadow, had indeed left their mark. The projector's light, in its simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical, depths of human nature in wartime. It had forced a confrontation with empathy, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the brutal realities of conflict. The sound of the whirring projector, once a source of ambiguous threat, now echoed in the chambers of their memory as a symbol of an unsettling truth, a truth that would forever shape their re-entry into a world struggling to rebuild. The question of why had begun to find its answers in the long-term, subtle shifts in perception and the quiet, persistent memories that refused to be silenced. The legacy was multifaceted. For the Americans, it offered fragmented but invaluable insights into the Japanese psyche, influencing post-war occupation strategies and intelligence doctrine. For the Japanese prisoners, those who survived and eventually returned home, the memory of those flickering images, of shared laughter and tears with their former enemies, became an indelible part of their trauma and their re-entry into a shattered world. It wasn't a story of wholesale conversion, but of profound, unsettling encounters that defied easy categorization. The war was fought with bombs and bullets, but in these remote camps, another battle raged, a quiet, psychological conflict waged with the universal language of cinema. The projector's light, in its simple act of illumination, revealed not just stories on a screen, but the profound, often paradoxical depths of human nature in wartime. The initial chill of the desert night and the bracing for torture and humiliation had given way to an unexpected warmth, not of comfort, but of baffling human connection. The projector, in its quiet power, had become a conduit for an understanding that transcended the brutality of war, leaving an aftertaste of complex truth. It proved that even in the darkest hours, the shared experience of storytelling could illuminate the most unexpected corners of the human heart, leaving a legacy far beyond the battlefield. To delve into the sources and continue this line of stories, access the complete playlist on WW2 Beyond Battles and save the dossier in the pinned comment.